Hey guys, this is a little bit of an impromptu video. I was just reading from Nietzsche's Human All Too Human. And there was a passage in there that, was really making me ponder a lot. I figured I should just film some of my reflections on this, see what you think. Basically, there's a passage where he's talking about different examples of humans engaging in altruistic behavior. He talks about a soldier who's willing to die for his country. He talks about a mother who, sacrifices sleep and sacrifices her health and her resources to raise up a child. And he talks about just kind of the ego. And he's basically saying, are these things fundamentally selfish or selfless, right? If you desire to sacrifice yourself for your country, there's a certain amount of selfishness implicit in doing what you want, right? Just because you want to do something for others doesn't subtract the fact that you actually want this, right? So yeah, I've often been persuaded that there's an element of selfishness in selflessness, right? But that doesn't reduce its importance in thinking about the difference, right? Like, just because we would often think that selfless behavior is better, and I think it can still be better, but I think it's useful to remember the context is there's a certain element of selfishness, right? And probably that would be good reason to subtract out the feeling of moral superiority, right? There's evolutionary reasons, like creatures that evolve to be groupish, that they evolve to be cooperative. If you get dopamine for serving the group, then maybe that helps the group survive. And there's a certain evolutionary selfishness to, I'm helping myself survive by helping the group survive, right? And like, just because you're programmed to work for the group and someone else is programmed to just work for themselves, by dopamine in the brain, like, you didn't choose to have a brain that gets dopamine from cooperation. So like, I guess we can subtract a little bit of moral superiority in the recognition of the roots of these drives. But that we shouldn't be clouded by the fact we shouldn't think that everything is equal. I think that cooperative behaviors are superior to selfish behaviors. So we got to keep the game theoretic mentality, which is we can judge the quality of different strategies, right? Some strategies are superior game theoretically, and we want to keep that in mind while subtracting out moral superiority. Perhaps it's complicated. Those are some thoughts, but then there's more to this passage from Nietzsche. His final line is fascinating. He says, in ethics, man does not consider himself an individuum. He considers himself a dividuum. I was like, what the heck is he talking about? I've never heard of that before. So I Googled around. I'm like, wow, okay. So an individuum, it's basically the same thing as the etymology of an individual. And so an individual, it's fascinating. The etymology is in means not, and dividual means divisible, dividable, right? And like, once you start thinking about the word individual in terms of not dividable, that like opens up a whole, like, there's lots of different directions you can go with that thought process, right? Like, America is founded on these individualism principles, right? The rights and sacredness of the individual, and the whole concept of indivisible, right? The nation, the United States, is indivisible. So like, it's almost like there's multiple layers to this analysis where we're indivisible at the individual layer, and then we're indivisible at the collective layer. It's like, what's going on here? This is fascinating. But Nietzsche, he's, being a skeptic, he's like, actually, we're not indivisible. We are divisible, right? This whole indivisible stuff is like some sort of a false metaphor, right? It's kind of a metaphorically true, literally false fiction, right? Useful fiction. It's like, whoa, wait, what's going on here? Are we divisible or are we indivisible, right? And so, okay, so what are we even talking about? So as an individual, why would we consider ourselves indivisible, right? So part of the concept of indivisible is unity, right? If you're divided, you're not unified. And so like, the United States has the word unity as an adjective. The whole concept is we're united, therefore we're not divisible. And so in that sense, it kind of makes sense that humans are indivisible, which is to say we are united. We've got billions of cells all working together in this, functional unity. And not perfectly, but we're alive, we're accomplishing goals, right? If our leg just decided to secede from the union, it wouldn't be very good for our survival if our legs started rebelling and doing whatever it wants to do instead of helping us walk. We'd be tripping and falling off bridges and stuff. So we're generally pretty unified, and that helps us accomplish our goals. And at a collective level, that's relevant too. Like the more like if we all follow the federal laws, we can kind of accomplish these larger unific goals. So there's a certain metaphorical utility to this concept of unity, where it's like, and like there's a reality to it. Like we are united in some ways. So that's good. But then what is this concept of divisibility, right? Divisibility would be the lack of unity or the lack of coherent, structure that is indivisible, right? Like technically at a very reductive level, we're very divisible, right? So like it's almost like this, the individual, the indivisible, the unity is at this emergent level. And when we reduce things to their fundamentals, we start getting down to the divisibility, right? Technically, we're divisible into billions of atoms, trillions. And so when we think about psychology, right, the context of what Nietzsche is talking about is the psychology of morality. And so in our brains, we're kind of divisible. We've got multiple motivations going on, right? So my understanding of the neuroscience of selfishness and selflessness is that they can be located, these drives can be located in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So like right here, if you go deep, if you go 1 inch right between here, the third eye, right? You go right here and then you go deeper by like one inch about, that's your ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's kind of a little ball-shaped section of the brain, walnut size perhaps. And that part of the brain is like a yin-yang. It's split in half, where like half of the sphere is selfish and half the sphere is selfless. And so every time your brain is processing your goals, right, this little ventromedial prefrontal cortex is right next to your values and your identity, right? So this is like agental material. It's like when we consider ourselves an agent, we are an entity that has goals, it has an identity, and we process these values in order to judge options to accomplish our goals. And so this ventromedial prefrontal cortex, it looks like the location of our agency. And so it's fascinating that selfishness and selflessness is being processed right next to our agency, right? And so what that means is that the religious intuition that, there's this phrase that there's something like there's a good wolf and a bad wolf inside you, and they're constantly fighting. And the question is, which one do you feed, right? And you become the good wolf if you feed the good wolf, and he can overpower the bad wolf. And from the brain, from the neuroscience perspective, it's like, wow, that's kind of fascinating, because parts of the brain can grow. Like neurons that fire together, wire together. If you build habits in the brain, those pathways in the brain get stronger. So there's a realistic parallel to this religious metaphor that maybe if you practice habits of selflessness, then you can strengthen that altruism in your brain. So yeah, I think there's good reason to think that there's, the possibility for growth, for self-transformation, for the ability to, develop more altruism through these developing habits that grow these neurological connections, in your brain. So I think that's a very hopeful way to think about, the individual. The fact that we can strengthen these different pathways within ourselves leads to this very hopeful view that we can become what we want to become, right? But this leads us closer and closer to the concept of agency. And so when we're thinking about how the individual functions like an agent, right? The unity of all the parts is working towards the same goal. That's what makes us an agent, right? That's what makes us an individual, right? The unity. But what about this divisibility? How does this if the divisibility affects our individuality, how does it affect our agency, right? So I was talking to my brother a little bit about this. He made some interesting points. He was kind of saying something to the effect of, well, we are an individual in the fact that you cannot divide us without changing who we are. And so psychologically, if you do split brain, if you have split brain patients, right, there's a common phenomenon where the two halves of the brain, you can ask different halves of the brain questions and you can get a response from just one half of the brain. What they find is that splitting the brain in half creates two personalities. And there's interesting patterns between these two halves. Sometimes one half is more atheistic and one half is more religious. One half can be happier, the other is more, depressed. One is more hopeful, one is more realistic. All these interesting nuances where, different halves of the brain have different biases, and when you unify the brain, the atheistic bias gets mitigated by the religious bias. The unhappy bias gets mitigated by the happy bias, and we land at some average. Our individual attribute is the average of these two halves, where when you split the brain in half, suddenly the former individual who had this average happiness no longer exists. It's now there's a new individual who has a higher level of happiness and a lower level of happiness. So that's a fascinating idea that justifies the concept of individuality, right? Where we aren't divisible because we can't maintain our identity post-division, right? So that's kind of a cool way to think of it. And so if you think about that from an agency perspective, all of our components are working together towards the same goals, and that's why we function successfully. But John Locke was a philosopher who discussed, free will and agency, and during the Enlightenment period a long time ago, and he kind of emphasized, the compatibilist view of free will, which he was kind of emphasizing how, if you're not coerced, then that's basically, that's free agency, that's liberty. And so, like, what is this whole coercion business? How does that affect agency, right? Well, the agent has the agent's goals, right? So me as a human, I have, human goals, which there's a hierarchy of goals, but they kind of all reduce to something like existence, right? Survival is based on existence, making money, eating, it's all based on existence, reproducing, more copies existing, right? All goals kind of reduce to existence. And my components are working harmoniously towards, my existence and the existence of my DNA, and everyone's kind of like that. But what happens when we're coerced, right? And so, like, the concept of slavery or a gun to your head, open up the safe, stuff like that, robbery. So, like, coercion, what seems to be the case is that when you're coerced, someone threatens one of your goals. So if someone puts a gun to your head, they are threatening your goal of, being alive. And then they're saying, well, you need to give me all your money or else I'm going to kill you, right? And that, it puts two of your goals in conflict with each other, right? You want to have money because money helps existence, and you want to be alive because being alive helps existence. But suddenly, when these goals are pitted against each other, you have to choose which goal is higher in priority, and a lot of people choose being alive. Well, being alive is a higher priority than money. Okay, so what is happening from an agency standpoint? You are being forced to sacrifice your goals. And goals are kind of the definition of agency, right? So if you're forced to sacrifice one of your goals in preference for another, you're kind of giving up your agency in a way. It's like, for slavery, it's like, I want to work for my family, but instead, at the threat of violence, I'm being forced to work for your family. I have to give up my family. I have to give up my goals in exchange for your goals because, my life is being threatened. And so there's a certain amount of, when you pit your own goals against each other, that's kind of this divisibility concept, right? So it's almost like coercion harms your agency and it simultaneously harms your individuality because it's dividing you against yourself, right? And I think Jesus said, a house divided against itself shall not stand. And I guess that's the importance of unity. And so that's kind of a fascinating way to think about how individuals are connected to agency, divisibility is connected to coercion, and goals are connected to, this concept of, if your goals being pitted against each other, it like creates a lack of unity, right? And I think that goes into like the biology of like cancer. Cancer, like normally all of your component parts, all of your cells are working together for the same goal. But from my understanding of, Michael Levine's work, he basically says that the cancer cells, they've basically forgotten what the unific goal is. And so instead of working together towards this goal of humanity, they forget that they're a human and they start acting like bacteria. And the goal of bacteria is to just reproduce exponentially and fill space time with your cellular materials, you know. And so they don't understand that they're in a greater context. And so they just start reproducing, and they've got their own goal, which is, bacterial goal of just unlimited growth. And that unlimited growth becomes a tumor, and it metastasizes and it gets out of control. And your ability to function as an agential individual gets sabotaged because within you, you're divided against yourself. Like some of you wants to do the human goal, some of you wants to do the bacterial goal, and it's not compatible. You need that unity to survive. And so, yeah, when Nietzsche says that we are divisible, he is kind of pointing to the idea that we are not, when we try to do ethics, we're not that coherent. We're full of contradictions. We've got all these different motivations. We've got different goals. Yeah. Jonathan Haidt, he talks about how we have like 5 different moral taste buds. We've got we worry about harm. We worry about authority. We worry about loyalty. We worry about purity and sanctity. And so we've got all these different things that we're worried about, and they can be conflicting, right? And so I guess Nietzsche, he's kind of highlighting how, we're kind of self-conflicted. And that's important to keep in mind. But I think as we've discussed so far, like, despite the fact that we're reductively divisible, this emergent unity is really important. And I guess that's the philosophic drive for coherence, for avoiding self-contradiction, getting rid of some of these unconscious biases to like make us more, get rid of the cognitive dissonance of having 2 contradictory motivations. If we can unify our psychology, that's probably healthier, and it'll probably point us in better directions. And so I guess both is the answer.